I'm like, I'd like to dilate on the subject of um, the like the main alternatives in the world today. So, on and through partially in a kind of Gedanken Reden or thinking in speech, as von Kleist has written on. Um, but partly as a critique of Dugin's nohomachia or multipolarity. Dugin claims we're already in the war of multipolarity. Um, yeah, are we in the war of multipolarity, or are we in the second cave, as Strauss calls it, allowing for the simple definition of the cave as the jabbering of all the different opinions, of all the different, especially of the noisier factions who have sort of lockstep opinions, such as the Trumpians and the sort of Robert Reich Democrats. So really, there's a war of sub, sort of jabbering. There's a barbaric. There's barbarism. Really, there's just barbarism because none of it's really. It's all polemical, and none of it's really up to a fair standard intellectually. So let's situate Dugin's version by. Dugin's basically claiming he can transform this barbarism into a decent order of the earth. Nomos of the earth, as Schmidt put it. Except he puts it on the level of nous, the principle of basic induction. Basic, sort of not a natural way to speak in American English, but basic intuition, but simply meaning taking in the world, and in the Greek sense, taking in what something is. That's a tree. Nous is supposed to be what accomplishes that. So the war of nohomachia refers to nous. Let's try to situate it by looking at the question of empire as against what comes after empire. So, for instance, Lord Curzon says about the year 1900 or so, the English referred to their king, but only in India did they speak of the king emperor, or the regina imperatrix, as Victoria was known. And he makes specifically this distinction between the imperator, or it's pronounced differently often, and the king, the Roman imperator, who has a different kind of authority. He has an authority over a congeries of different communities. Whereas the king back in London, at least still in those days, so some very wealthy men, when they died, would sometimes leave their fortune in those days to the British Empire, because the idea is we're all of the same race, and we're pursuing this. You get those words in the beginning of the U.S. Constitution too, like that we're going to preserve everything for future generations, or it's not expressed in exactly those words, but that this spirit was alive seems to be shown in, I think, as Cecil Rhodes left a huge fortune specifically to the British Empire around 1900 or so. Whereas you couldn't imagine that today, right? Somebody would leave their fortune to a university to build a building of some kind, but they wouldn't leave it it's hard to believe anyone's going to leave their billions to pay off the debt. But now then there's the other reason, since we touched on the subject, we have to sort of show that the economic arguments, all the clarification on what's happening economically show, I think at the same time, arguments that are directly have a bearing on whether the multipolarity is realistic or not. The reason the debt is so high is basically because it's a loan shark situation, which is that the wealthiest Americans simply enjoy taking in the interest on the loans they're giving to themselves, in effect. So it's like it's I guess the loan shark is the simplest way to put it. But they're loan sharking on them, like on the power of the United States to create money ex nihilo, something like that. So therefore, they're not going to. Some misguided person could do that, but it would immediately be countermanded, I think. But say in a real sense, that's the heavy gravity of the cosmos, so far as human beings are concerned. I mean, maybe on another galaxy or in some equally physics account that doesn't really have anything to do with daily life. It's different, but in reality, the core is around that debt in a way, and all the people that are parasitical on that debt. And those are the Atlanticists and the Primicists. So say, come and join our club. But why is the club both? Now we have to make some do some extreme nuances. Why is this? Remember, there was the Dutch guilder, the British pound sterling, and now the dollar. This is all goes together. But why is the dollar empire so different? So one is what I think that just what I mentioned, in connection with the fact that nobody really feels themselves part of a collective they want to sacrifice for together as like a family, or as a huge family of the English felt themselves around 1900 or so, or at least as the people that went to the British public schools believed them to feel, such as Lord Curzon, Eton, the old Etonians, and so on. So that's, I think, a major difference. So you had kingship based on that, and then in India you couldn't extend kingship because the people were also different and they weren't really part of it. But then let's draw another issue, which is really under the reason Dugin tends towards this empire situation is because under empire there were a lot of people that were happy to be under empire, in the sense of, the Moguls and the Rajas who are keeping us in slavery are gone, and now we're just under empire, but they don't really care what we do in the provinces or whatever, in the Cock Mountains or something. If you're in the middle of nowhere doing your dhyana or your karmic work or whatever, nobody cared. So this is kind of, I think this is why Dugin especially favors empire, because it's not really autonomy. It's more like nobody cares that you exist, and you like that. You don't want to be educated. You don't want democracy spread where you are. You don't want to participate in the vote. You're already happy doing what you're doing. You colonize us, but don't mentally colonize us, something like that. So that was actually true to some extent, I think, under India. And I know there's a ton of books by progressives and Graeber-leaning type of guys that will tell you otherwise, but that's a selective history. What can I say? I mean, let me give actual statement, because John Kenneth Galbraith said that the Indian polymath, P.C. Mahalanovus, I believe his name is. He was kind of a statistician, but he was also had degrees in other areas, who was in close with the circle of the first Indian British prime minister, who I think visited UC Berkeley at one time, Nehru. And he said, for the first 100 years, we know absolutely that the British were hailed as saviors for throwing off the Rajas and the horrible conditions. And then, the progressives will immediately answer that, but isn't it better to be, enslaved by, they won't say, but they won't question it, that they'll just state it, they'll say, oh no, but it's better to be enslaved by your own people, at least it's their own people, something like that, which I think is just irrational. It's something to say. Now, obviously, the Monty Python thing about what did the Romans do has some sense to it. That's why it's funny. But okay, then let's test whether this is possible at all by giving a case, and that's the theory of the case. And the case is, remember George Bush, the younger, saying he looked into Putin's eyes and into his soul, and he said, I wouldn't have invited him out to the ranch if I didn't, thoroughgoingly trust this man. And I think that the issue is, like, Putin thought, okay, I can be a province in your empire. You ignore us, you don't care what we do, or the province in the empire, it's fine. That was what was happening. So the reason Dugin's solution seems in peril, his desire to turn Ukraine into a rose, is this radically powerful will of the that's cathected around mining all the cosmic forces, as it were, from that debt. That they're all that won't suffer the slightest diminution of their incomes for no reason. And so then we have this situation where there's powerful will linked to the Eisenhower stuff, which is in some transfigured. I mean, it's no longer really an industrial complex, is it? It's more like some kind of I don't know. OS4 mini, like agential AI complex of some kind. Very soon, because there's like war of algorithms in contests between Palindrome and his enemies and so on the foreign exchange markets. So, by the way, that's why Xi doesn't trade in volume on the foreign exchange markets. That's called non-convertibility of the currency. So the biggest sanction that the NATO bloc and the Davos people and the people who are cathected around that debt have is cutting off all the gains that you get from the central bank rates and from all that stuff. So Xi can't play on that game because his currency would be crushed immediately, like Turkey. Turkey's a special case because it has some kind of Muslim system of trust and some kind of semi-socialized businesses that operate at the core of it, so it can stay going even though it's totally crushed in terms of the big FX players. But in any case, I think that shows a bit of what the forces that are actually in play are. And then we have to ask, to what extent, if those forces in play are, one, agential AI, two, physics, the whole basic physics and everything it can do with the quantum computing and so on, And everything else is already doing on a much simpler level with the drone warfare, which is then modified by the kind of guerrilla tactics of human beings who know the day-to-day alleyways and so on, and not just the Matrix version. That combination has apparently proved to be very impressive, and some general came out with a talk and said this is the most impressive innovations with these drones in Ukraine since Genghis Khan invented the how do you call that on the parts of the rig for riding a horse, which allowed his soldiers to stand up in the stirrups and fire arrows from a great distance at a high speed, and this was just like unstoppable. But in any case, that's kind of interesting that there's a connection between the drones and the human ingenuity on that advance. But basically, I think this situation involves so many non-human factors which are part of our structures, so that Heidegger is justified in speaking of that. Basically what he's saying is we are the technological essence, because that's what's at work at the core of the things that genuinely concern us, such as this whole spreading, which cannot merely colonize, but either can it make everybody genuinely part of the same concern, so they're genuinely willing to sacrifice and feel like what becomes of the country after they die will really be part of their thing. That's no longer possible. So what did they do, and what is it instead? Instead, it's some kind of I don't know. They introduce forced kind of Pan Am smile and affect work. They introduce rules-based order, but as a kind of daily life morality, which changes the way people live daily life. They introduce stronger. I suppose under empire, the other difference is there's not all the so-called checks and balances and the protections of individuals. So they introduce all that, but in a way that it's obviously somehow it's not really better. It's somehow more, in fact, it's more totalitarian. So yeah, I guess you'd have to ask, these are very deep forces, and how so far and Hegelian terms, how so far is the idea going to be able to deal with this Schwere, or the spirit of reality, the spirit of gravity in the full sense?